Ratings agency Fitch says it's at risk of default as a series of debt payments come due. Russia. Due to international sanctions against the country, Russia's central bank can't access its foreign reserves of $640 billion. The government says that it wants to make the payment in rubles, but that would not be accepted on a dollar-denominated bond. If Russia can't make the full and correct payment within 30 days, the country would be considered in default. Well, Anna Grossman is an associate professor at Loughborough University in the UK and researches the Russian economy. Thank you very much for joining us, Anna. How is Russia's economy coping under the strain of sanctions?
The Russian economy has been hit extremely hard by the sanctions. The most difficult part right now for the Russian businesses is due to the increased cost of financing, due to the devaluation of ruble. So the businesses are looking at different types of payments, such as cryptocurrencies or gold. And at the same time, the government is introducing new legislations, new measures, subsidies to facilitate the continuing operations of Russian businesses in Russia and abroad. So, for instance, there is a new legislation which might allow the abundant assets by the Western companies to be temporarily managed by an external administrator and then sold at auction to a new buyer. There is another legislation coming in place to stabilize the exchange rate of the Russian ruble against the dollar by providing better liquidity to the Russian bank and decreasing the amount of speculative transactions. So clearly, Russian government is reacting to these sanctions as much as they can.
Well, you say temporarily acquired. I think it sounds much more like expropriation if we're looking at the end result with the auctions. What are companies doing, though, to adapt themselves to these sanctions? After all, things have changed rapidly in just the past few weeks.
So the hardest part, as I mentioned, is the increased cost of financing. So the businesses will be looking at different types of payments, such as cryptocurrencies or gold. The government is also introducing a temporary cancellation of the custom tax on critically imported goods for the next 6 months. So that would facilitate or diminish some of the increased costs on imports of critical products and components, such as vegetables and grain, food ingredients, pharmaceutical components, textiles, some of the metals, construction materials, and spare parts for aircrafts.
OK, so from the Russian perspective, there has been talk that it will be absolutely necessary for Russia to pivot its supply chains that have been cut off in Europe to China. How realistic do you think that is?
Well, it is not entirely unrealistic, since China is already a major trading partner in Russia. Chinese brands, for example, comprise 60% of the Russian smartphone market. But the ruble devaluation and sanctions may be slowing down the Chinese companies' abilities to replace their Western counterparts in Russia as quickly as possible.
Okay.
However, Russia will be increasing its trade flows with China and India, and that includes the construction of new pipelines to redirect gas from Europe to China, which is more of a, medium-term strategy.
Well, I'd like to pick up on the Russian gas aspect, because there has been talk of either one side or the other turning off the Russian gas taps to Europe. How serious would that step be for the Russian economy?
Well, that step will be extremely serious, because the construction of new pipelines to redirect gas from Europe to Eurasia or China is not going to happen overnight. So this is not like with oil tankers that can be redirected pretty quickly. So Russia will be impacted by this decision of closing Russian gas supply towards Europe quite severely in the short term.
Mm-hmm. And how urgent is Russia's debt situation right now? As we've heard, the risk of default exists. So how would you analyse that?
Well, in some respect, those companies that hold Russian sovereign debt have been already adjusting to this complication in payments, with more than 20 funds having frozen their portfolios with significant Russian investment, while other funds have written down the value of their Russian investment significantly. So if Russia defaults, investors can, of course, claim money on their default insurance, but going through insurance and courts is costly. So investors might be just advised to hold on to their bonds for now. Russian debt default might also trigger payments on CDS market, which is a derivative product used to protect against government default. But still, because of ongoing sanctions, it may be difficult to recover those payments on SDS as well. However, the default on Russian debt is unlikely to start a global financial crisis like in the 90s due to the relative limited exposure to Russia by foreign investors in this situation.
OK, well, whatever happens, there's still plenty more pain to come for Russia by the looks of it. But thank you very much, Anna Grossman, for joining us. It was a pleasure to hear from you.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, China says the impact of sanctions on Russia will have a limited effect on its own economy. With regards to facilitating trade with Russia after the country's exit from the SWIFT global payment system, Beijing is offering a workaround using the Chinese CIPS system, although it can only process payments in Yuan. The Chinese government also promises support for financial markets to keep them stable amidst ongoing crises. Well, here's what the head of China's National Bureau of Statistics had to say.
In terms of direct impact, Russia and Ukraine account for a small proportion of China's import and export trade, so the direct impact is limited. Of course, due to geopolitical changes, the impact on global commodity prices is still relatively obvious, and the pressure of domestic imported inflation may increase. Despite these problems, we must also see that we still have many favorable conditions to ensure domestic energy supply.
Well, there's plenty to dig into here as well, and we couldn't do it without Fraser Howey, author of Red Capitalism, who joins us now. Thank you very much, Fraser. We're 3 weeks into the war. China is not taking any clear sides on this, and they want to show themselves, or at least they have said that they want to depict themselves as a global power, an alternative to the West, yet they're missing in action. Why is China not stepping up on either side?
I think because much of that rhetoric, which many in the West and many in Europe have fallen for, that China, it's the Chinese century, frankly, it's just been rhetoric. And that when the stakes could not be higher at the moment, and China has a real opportunity to step forward and make a difference. It clearly has leverage with Vladimir Putin. It has a no-limits friendship pact. And yet it's trying to manage this very undiplomatic neutrality. And I think it's partly because a lot of their talk is simply hot air.
So there's been lots of talk of Russia's pivot to China. Is this an opportunity, or is Russia's economic weight simply negligible for China?
I think your previous guest said it. Ultimately, the Russian economy is a very small part of the global economy. It's a very small customer of Chinese goods. China, of course, does have a lot of tie-ins for hydrocarbons and commodities, and I think that will continue. China is not going to be sanctioning Russia at all, and they're going to continue with those contracts as best they can. But you have to remember as well that the Russian economy is effectively seizing up. And that's going to have knock-on impacts into the Chinese economy as well. Can ultimately Russia supply the oil and the gas and other minerals while at the same time fighting a war and having your economy go into freefall?
But it does fit into a modus operandi for China, right? Because it fits into China's plan. Investments in Africa, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative. It could see Russia as at least part of that, at least if its companies can replace Western ones in Russia, for example, or it could lend to Russia. Well, do you see it as a new domain of influence for China?
To some extent, but I think it's a very limited domain, and it's a pretty poor friend to choose. Ultimately, Russia, rightly so, has a long history, long civilization, rich culture, and the Russians are not simply going to become a vassal state of the Chinese and roll over and do as the Chinese say. Certainly, while Putin is in power, he is clearly a very unstable and unpredictable leader, which means that that's a lot of problems for China. So China may say, hey, we've got Russia very much in our economic pocket, but at the same time, that will almost certainly then have a negative impact for China's relations with America, with Japan, with the rest of Asia, with the rest of Europe.
OK, we can talk about money flows, GDP and so on, but is there realistically any benefit to China in using Russia's natural resources as Europe used its oil and gas?
Look, China needs a lot of commodities, but Russia was selling those commodities anyway. So in that sense, it's not really got a much better position than where it was before. It was a big buyer of Russian commodities. It will continue to be a relatively big buyer of them. As I say, China has prospered for 30 years in a stable global political environment, and Russia has completely upended that. And frankly, China's all at sea.
OK, one more. Where do you think this goes next, Fraser?
Sadly, I think this will probably drag on for some time. I think it's just too difficult to say. I think, though, clearly it has woken up the Germans, the Europeans, and even the Americans to the risks of engagement with Russia and mismanaging engagement. And I think it will also then turn on China as well and say, if we don't like totalitarian Russia, then why are we so comfortable with totalitarian China? So in that sense, I do see it as a realignment of much of Europe with America, and is what we used to call the free world.
OK, plenty of lessons learned there. Also for China, by the looks of it. Fraser Howey, thank you very much for your analysis on that.
Thank you.
Well, as we heard, the war in Ukraine and the subsequent sanctions against Russia had sent prices for commodities, gas and oil upwards recently, but it's also driven the prices for other raw materials. In particular, nickel has rocketed.
You can find it in coins, stainless steel, electronics, electric car batteries. It's nickel, the fifth most abundant element on Earth, and now the protagonist of a never-before-seen global pricing crisis ignited by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In 2021, Russia was the world's largest exporter of refined nickel. While the EU and the US haven't targeted the material with sanctions, global buyers frenzied to look for alternative sources, sending prices through the roof. On February 24th, the day of the invasion, nickel reached the already high price of $26,000 per ton. In early March, pricing started rising steadily, spiking to $100,000 on March 8th, before settling at $80,000 per ton. The London Metal Exchange, which sets global prices for industrial nickel, halted all transactions for the whole week. With an unprecedented decision, it also cancelled all trades for March 8, capping the price at $48,000. The nickel crisis sent sparks flying through the whole industry. Chinese tycoon Xiang Guangda, who bet on nickel prices falling, now has to find a way to bail out his company, Tsingshan Holding, as it struggles to cover short positions worth around $8 billion. The pressure on the industry is so high that even Vladimir Putin, the head of Russian mining giant Nornickel, felt the urge to comment in an interview with Russian broadcaster RBC. He warned against Russia responding by seizing Western properties, as it would take the country back to the isolation of a century ago. The recovery of the Russian economy will depend on the depth of the crisis we enter. The sooner this situation is resolved and the sooner normal dialogue with partners resumes, the softer the consequences for our country will be. Nornickel is another example of how the invasion of Ukraine is playing against Russia's economic interests. But it's far from clear that the increasingly nervous stance of tycoons like Putin could bring pressure on Vladimir Putin to end the war.
So it's a very difficult situation with some difficult questions, and now it's time for you to ask the questions. We've been trawling through the comments beneath our YouTube videos to find out what our viewers want to know, and Ashutosh Pandey joins me now to answer some of those questions. Ashutosh, what's our global online audience talking about the most?
Well, Daniel, it's the community is mainly buzzing with issues around over-reliance on Russian oil and gas. Then how far would China actually go in supporting Russia? And there's, of course, talk around coal, the return of coal. The king coal is back. That's one of the topics that actually is of great interest to our audiences all around the world.
OK, and I want to give you a viewer question here. So M. Gronich asks, will China start to aid Russia in a significant way? And what would be the economic consequences of such a move? That's from M. Gronich.
Well, it looks highly unlikely. China wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of US or Western sanctions. We've got to understand that the Chinese economy isn't really in the best of shapes at this point in time. It's growing at the slowest pace in more than 3 decades. Consumer spending is low. The IT sector has been hit hard by the crackdown by the government. Then the real estate sector continues to reel from high amount of debt. So it's really problematic. And then the COVID situation is still raging there, and the zero COVID policy is not helping either. So China really wouldn't want to inflict more pain by overtly supporting Russia here, because these are some of the harshest sanctions that have been imposed against Russia, and it would really be painful for not only the Chinese economy but also for President Xi, who is looking to secure another term this year.
OK, and another question here from the account Pros and Cons. How could successive German governments not see this coming? They know what Russia is like and has been, yet still put themselves in a position to be massively reliant on one country for their energy. Ashutosh, what do you have to say? What do you think?
Well, that's a question that we've been getting quite a bit now. I think many people are asking this question, especially when they see that this over-reliance means that the European Union, Germany, is actually having to bankroll this war that Russia is waging. But yes, in my opinion, I think the government has been caught off guard. They became too comfortable with this relationship that they had with Russia. It's decades-old relationship. It has stood the test of time. Even during the Cold War, Russia kept actually supplying oil and gas. So clearly they felt comfortable there. They felt that this interdependence on each other would actually hold this relationship steady. But that's not the case, as they are now realizing. And even before this war started, there were these problems because Russia was trying to hold back on gas supplies to ensure that the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline was actually approved as quickly as possible. But now I think it's going to change forever, because there have been pledges from not only the German government, but also the European Union to reduce their reliance on Russia for gas.
Thank you very much for that, Ashutosh Pandey, for answering our viewer questions. You can find our YouTube page under DW News on youtube.com. So refugees have been leaving Ukraine, of course, but where are they actually going to? To any one of Ukraine's neighbours, Moldova, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, or even to Belarus and Russia. But more than anywhere else, they're heading to Poland. And it's provided a warm welcome to weary Ukrainians. The Poles also share the fear of many of Ukraine's neighbours, that they could be next on Putin's list. Well, DW's Marta Grzyńska reports from in and around the Polish capital.
Baking free bread for Ukrainian refugees in Warsaw.
Staples like bread are so important, and this is something that the bakeries can provide. Fortunately, making bread doesn't cost that much, so we can afford to do it. It's a natural response to want to help at a time like this. Everyone around us is helping, and we want to do our part too.
Help is certainly needed like never before. Every day, tens of thousands of refugees from Ukraine are arriving in Warsaw, and they all need to be provided for. It's a huge task for the city. Warsaw's train stations have become makeshift accommodation for many refugees. "60 kilometers outside of Warsaw. In the town of Wachów, we meet a group of refugees at a hotel. For them, it's a few days' respite after seeing their lives turned upside down by war. The Pałac Hotel is part of the Ache group that runs hotels all over Poland. 18 of them have offered to take in a total of 5,000 refugees for free.
Some families stay with us for 4, 5 or 6 nights. In the first week and a half, we provided accommodation for 3,500 refugees, helping them through those very first difficult days after fleeing Ukraine.
The company says it's a major undertaking even for a business of its size. Volunteers are coming to the hotel to keep the children entertained. Without them and the many other helpers, the hotel wouldn't be able to manage.
We can keep going until the end of March, helping everyone we can. But from April onwards, we already have a lot of bookings. We're hoping all these people will have some kind of long-term accommodation by then.
But the hotel manager is also hoping to provide long-term help for some refugees in the form of a job.
I've already employed 2 women from Ukraine. 3 others are working on a voluntary basis right now and have expressed interest in a job. We'll look into that as soon as their status here has been clarified. All the other hotels in the Achu group are also interested in giving jobs to the refugees. It's a way of helping long term rather than just for a month or 2.
Out on the streets, the broad public support for Ukraine is evident. It's the same right across Poland. Even this small hostel in Warsaw has made some rooms available for refugees.
I couldn't imagine not doing something to help at a time like this. But it would be too much for me on my own. My partner has taken the time off work so that we can focus totally on helping.
The help they're providing goes beyond accommodation and food. Most of the refugees will need longer-term support if they're to find their feet here.
With the help of our neighbours, we've been able to organise dance classes for the children, for example. For the women that were interested, we've set up job interviews. And we got in contact with a school that the children can go to.
Jak będzie potrzeba, tyle będziemy piec.
We'll bake as much bread as is needed, whether it's 10, 15 or 20 loaves a day. But then we'll probably need help.
Right now, many businesses are willing to go the extra mile, but they'll need help if this is to continue for weeks or even months to come.